Sometimes it's good to take a step back and look at some of the foundations so that we can better understand the structure. So I figured it might be a good time to just talk about group identity. Because I think it's something people take for granted as kind of a given. It's something that's very organic and subconscious. And so we tend to forget about it or not really understand it. And I was trying to think of some kind of analogies or just things that function in a similar way to kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. I think how market economies work is maybe not a bad example because you have this concept of spontaneous order or the invisible hand, or just the idea that somehow these very complex things just sort of happen and we take it for granted. Like if you're in a building, a large office building, you probably are assume that there's going to be a vending machine, and might go look for a vending machine even if you haven't seen one, because that's just generally speaking how things work. The market hasn't put an incentive for it to be there, so it's going to be there, and it's not like you don't think about the company that built it and put it there. You don't really think about the process involved. It's just there. Same thing for like any good or service you can imagine. Somebody probably is providing it at a price that's probably affordable to at least some people. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in business. Like there's still stores in Toronto that repair VCRs and sell VCR tapes. Sorry, VHS tapes. And maybe kind of transferring to a more relevant example, you have the idea of your national culture or your national food or your national traditions. Now, this is something that's often done as kind of a gotcha, largely by liberals who are trying to show that mainly Western countries don't have culture or don't have cuisine, and we need to bring people from other countries here in order to give us that. Now, the explanation for this, because you'll say, well, what is American culture to an American, or what is Canadian culture to a Canadian? And they won't be able to immediately explain it. They just have trouble. And that's because to them, that's just normal life. They've just subconsciously adapted to it. That's just the way they look at the world. So being asked to describe it is just strange. It just feels redundant. It's like, oh, it's just the food I eat every day. You don't really put any thought into it or anything like that. It's why it's kind of hard to explain what American cuisine is because you just eat it every day, and people in a lot of different countries of the world have copied American cuisine. So it's just something you don't really think about. Same thing with if you ask about like the traditions or the culture or stuff like that, and you're just put on the spot. It's just like, for instance, my family, in Canada Day in Canada, there's normally some sort of municipal event where you have street vendors and carnival games and stuff like that. And going down there and making sugar cookies, like that's something we do in Canada, is we make sugar cookies or gingerbread cookies and decorate them. And that would be kind of an aspect of Canadian culture. But if I was being asked about it, I wouldn't be able to really explain that. Whereas if you look at an anime or something and you see like the festivals they have there with fireworks and yukatas and kimonos and stuff like that, and the goldfish, that seems like a very well defined cultural thing because it's foreign and it's something you can kind of define. So this is why when you're someone from the outside looking in, you can offer a really big description of Arab culture, Japanese culture, Indian culture, and they can offer a description of yours, but you can't really describe your own because it's just who you are. And so that kind of transitions to the topic of group identity. So how this works is everybody is a member of a number of different groups, and within them they have different conflicting interests and characteristics that are kind of projected by these different groups. And these groups can be racial, like white, black. They can be religious, like Muslim, Jewish. They can be hobby based, like you're a gamer or you're a sports fan. They can be class based, like you're working class, you're upper class. There's all these different groups that kind of combine together to make the individual. And within the individual, these group identities kind of interact in a certain way, and people have preferences. Like some people might place their religion as being the single most important thing. So you'll have some very Christian people who are also kind of globalists. Like they might vote Republican or whatever, but they want more immigration so long as it's Christians from the third world, because that's what they place as being the most important thing. And then in contrast to that, you'll have people who their race and nation is by far the most important thing, and they don't regard religion as being important, or they don't have a religious group identity. So they try to invent maybe a neo-pagan or some sort of nationalist equivalent to a religion, because it's just an identity that they're either not a member of or they don't really have any ties to. I think an interesting phenomenon is that conservatives, in particular libertarians, tend to have this idea that group identity doesn't exist, or it's something that should be ignored or minimized or not considered. And anyone who proposes that these things matter is left wing, and everyone just has to be an individual. And it's kind of funny because there is a variety of different group identities implicit in that. Like libertarians tend to be male, like almost exclusively. They tend to be like middle or upper middle class. Maybe kind of a related concept is like atheists tend to be white. Like there aren't that many black atheists, for instance, but you'll have the atheists talk about like free thought or like individualism or something, when they generally speaking conform to, in most cases, a very specific demographic group. And obviously, not everybody interprets their group identity in the same way. Like, if we look at America, some of, I guess you could say, the more right wing American nationalists will see America as being a Christian nation, a largely white country that needs to be preserved, while as other people think it as purely a propositional concept, and it's good to have as many people from the rest of the world come because that enriches America. So you might have different people who focus on the same group identity but have very different interpretations of that identity, and also how it interacts with other identities. And I'd say to a large extent, the purpose of a political ideology or political movement is to unite a group of people using a shared identity, be it their religion, be it their socioeconomic group, be it their race, something to that effect, and bind them together. And oftentimes there are things that are complementary, like religiosity and nationalism often go together because religious people support the traditional family, generally speaking, and nationalists want a strong, structured society, and those two kind of go hand in hand. A lot of religious people believe very strongly in good and evil, and that goes hand in hand with someone who wants a strong law and order agenda. Now, there's very often multiple reasons for doing things. Like some people might be religious just because they value it, but also religious because they're a logical thinker and they looked at the evidence and the evidence was overwhelming to them and they were convinced on that standpoint. So people might be in favor of particular economic policy because it supports the market economy and they're a believer in the market economy, but also because it helps the other groups they're a member of, like maybe it helps black people or something to that effect. And I think that's kind of partially where intersectionality came in. And I'm not going to go too much into intersectionality, but the idea was to kind of take every identity group that wasn't heterosexual white Christian males and kind of bind them together into this grand alliance, even though there wasn't really that much overlap there. And I suppose another aspect of it is every society promotes certain identities and represses other ones. And I've said this in general, that every society has some form of political police and some form of political repression. And if you think your society doesn't have that, it's because you're part of the dominant faction, either politically or the dominant group in your society. Like in our society, there are certain group identities that are allowed to be promoted and are actively promoted, and certain group identities that are actively suppressed. And the most obvious one, and this is kind of very basic, is which groups are allowed to advocate for their racial or ethnic self interest. It's pretty common to have Chinese student associations that promote Chinese culture, encourage like Chinese people to marry one another, and stuff like that. Within a lot of southern Ontario, Chinese people will group together into communities and they will mutually support one another and maintain the uses of their language, often it being more widely used within their communities than English. And they will advocate for policies that help China, um, often over Canada. It's a case where their Chinese identity might be more important than any sort of Canadian identity. And probably the best example of this is obviously Black Lives Matter, which is a extremely strong group identitarian movement in which everything else is viewed as secondary to the group identity of blackness. And what's interesting about it is that a lot of people who aren't members of the group support it for ideological reasons. So you'll have people who are like white heterosexual males or whatever, who's something that's diametrically their group interests are completely and totally opposed to what BLM wants to achieve, but they will support it because they consider themselves to be a liberal, and that identity is more important to them than just about anything else. So you'll have advocacy organizations for the Chinese, you'll have stuff like Black Lives Matter, you'll have Jewish organizations, particularly ones that advocate on behalf of Israel. You'll have stuff like the ADL, which purpose is to go after people they feel is attacking the Jewish group identity. But generally speaking, white people and to a lesser extent Christians are allowed to pursue any sort of group identity. Like you can't have a white students association, you can't have like a European descended something or other association. That is a type of group identity that's not permitted. And you can have this from two different standpoints that are contradictory, but people will maintain together, which is either the concept of whiteness doesn't exist, but at the same time it does exist and it's evil. And like I said, these two things will occur at the same time. And more generally, I'd say we live in a society in which the dominant group identity that is actively promoted is liberalism or neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. And to varying degrees, all other forms of group identity have to sublimate themselves to this idea of having this globalized, multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious world, and that we have to achieve this globalized, blended world where everything's just kind of stuck through a blender and mixed together. And it's this kind of gets back to where a lot of conservatives don't understand, where they'll be like, what's the deal with woke capitalism? Because these people claim to be socialists or they claim to be economically left-winged, but they love big companies. And they love when they crush workers' rights, and they love when they evade taxes, and they give them a complete pass, and it seems completely incomprehensible to them. Well, the truth of the matter is these corporations support neoliberalism. They support and pander to the racial, gender, whatever the self-interest or the group identity is of the individual people. And that's what ultimately matters more to them. The economic stuff doesn't really matter. The anti-corporate stuff doesn't really matter. What matters is their racial identity or their cultural identity. So Black Lives Matter might be, at least theoretically, an anarchist or Marxist movement, but that's very much secondary to the black identitarianism of it. So if Pepsi or Visa or some big bank, it could even be a big bank that has foreclosed on a lot of black people, decides to go and support them, then they will support that company in turn because that's what they place as being the most important thing. If they have any religious belief, that'll once again be sublimated And you eventually will get like weird stuff like the Black Hebrew Israelites and stuff like that, where you try to take, I don't know, Christianity or Judaism or whatever it is and subjugate it to that. And you also get that with like weird stuff like Christian identity or neo-paganism or something to that impact. And I think that's generally speaking maybe the best way to try to understand someone else and what their motivations are is what are the main things that they identify as and or identify with, how they and how they interact with each other, and which ones are more important than others. So I think that covers pretty much everything I had wanted to say. Was trying to keep this relatively short by my standards and just kind of take a step back once again and look at this from a more foundational perspective. And because I think it's important to go back to first principles before you can really go and understand the end result of those.